I kept 2 bedrooms exactly the way my sons left them for almost 20 years. The same trophies, the same dusty guitar, waiting for suitcases that never came back up those stairs. Every single year, I told myself the same story. Just a few more years, and they'll come home for good. I believed that story through my husband's funeral. I believed it through birthdays celebrated over frozen video screens instead of at my own dinner table. I believed it right up until one ordinary Sunday evening call, when my own son finally said the words I had spent 2 decades refusing to imagine. What he told me that night didn't just break my heart. It forced me, at 64 years old, to ask a question I never thought I'd have to face this late in life. If the future I'd been waiting for was never going to arrive, then who was I supposed to become instead? This is my story. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a house built for 6 people but lived in by 1. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of waiting. And for almost 20 years, that silence has been the only roommate I have had. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a house built for 6 people but lived in by 1. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of waiting. And for almost 20 years, that silence has been the only roommate I have had. My name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that I spent the better part of my life believing that love, if it was strong enough, could hold a family in one place forever. I believed that if I cooked the same meals, kept the same rooms ready, and never once complained, my sons would eventually come home to stay. I was wrong. But it took a single video call, after 2 decades of hoping, for me to finally understand how wrong I was, and what that phone call cost me still haunts every quiet evening in this house. I grew up in Jaipur, a city of pink walls and old forts, where family was not just a word, but a structure you built your entire identity around. My mother used to say that a woman's real inheritance was not gold or land, but the number of people who would return to her table. By that measure, I believed I was going to be the richest woman in the world. I married young, the way most women of my generation did. My husband, Arvind, worked in a government office, steady and unremarkable in the best way, the kind of man who never raised his voice, who came home at the same hour every evening, who believed that stability was its own form of romance. We built a modest 2-story house on the edge of the old city, with a small courtyard where I grew marigolds and curry leaves. It was not a grand house, but it was full of noise, full of smells from the kitchen, full of 2 little boys running between rooms like the walls themselves belonged to them. I had 2 sons. The elder was quiet and serious from the time he could talk, the kind of child who lined up his books by height and asked questions that made the school teachers nervous. The younger was the opposite, loud, easily distracted, always trying to make his older brother laugh during dinner so that our strict household rules about silence at the table would collapse into chaos. I used to sit at the head of that table and think, this is it. This is the whole of my life, right here, and I will get to watch it multiply for the next 40 years. I packed their lunches every single day until they left for university in Delhi. I still remember standing at the gate of our house, waving until their rickshaw disappeared around the corner, feeling my chest tighten in a way I did not yet have the vocabulary to describe. That was the first time the house went quiet. I did not know then that it was only a rehearsal for a much longer kind of silence. They came home for holidays at first, dragging duffel bags full of laundry and stories about professors and roommates and city life. I would spend the days before their arrival cleaning their rooms obsessively, washing curtains that were already clean, buying their favorite sweets from the shop near the temple. Arvind used to tease me, saying I treated their homecomings like state visits. Maybe I did. Maybe some part of me already sensed that these visits would grow rarer and shorter with every passing year, and I was trying to store up enough memory to survive the gaps. The trouble, if you can call it that, began with a letter. My elder son had applied, without telling us at first, for a graduate program in engineering in the United States. When he finally worked up the courage to tell us over dinner, his voice had the careful, rehearsed quality of someone who had practiced the sentence many times in a mirror. He explained that it was only for a master's degree, 2 years at most, and that afterward, he planned to return and use what he learned to build something meaningful in India. I remember Arvind's reaction more than my own. He put down his spoon, looked at our son for a long moment, and said, "Good, go and see the world. Just remember where your roots are." I nodded along, because that is what a supportive mother does, but inside I felt something crack quietly, like a hairline fracture in a wall you don't notice until years later when the whole thing gives way. 2 years turned into an internship. The internship turned into a job offer that, in dollar terms, sounded like an unbelievable fortune to people earning rupees in Jaipur. We celebrated when he called to tell us. Of course we celebrated. What kind of parents would not be proud that their son had achieved something so many young men in our city could only dream of? I told my neighbors with genuine joy. I told the women at the temple. I did not yet understand that pride and grief can occupy the exact same sentence. My younger son followed 2 years later, drawn partly by his brother's success and partly, I think, by a fear of being left behind in a city he suddenly saw as smaller than it used to be. He went for a different reason, a company transfer, a chance at a life that felt bigger than anything Jaipur could offer a restless young man in his late 20s. By the time both of my sons had settled into their new lives on the other side of the world, our house, once so loud it sometimes gave me headaches, had become a place where I could hear the ceiling fan creak from 2 rooms away. I did not panic in those early years because I believed, truly believed, in the story we had all agreed to tell ourselves. They would work abroad for some years, save money, gain experience, and then return to India to settle down permanently. This was the plan we discussed on every phone call. "Just a few more years, Ma," they would say. "Once we've saved enough, once the job market improves back home, we'll come back and buy a proper flat in Jaipur, maybe even build a house of our own near yours." I held on to those words the way a person holds onto a rope over a canyon. Every year, I updated the timeline in my head. First, it was 5 years. Then it became after the children are a little older. Then, after we get our green cards, so it will be easier to travel back and forth. Each new reason sounded logical on its own. It was only much later, looking back at all of them stacked together, that I understood I had spent nearly 2 decades of my life inside someone else's postponed promise. I kept their rooms exactly as they had left them. My elder son's cricket trophies stayed on the shelf, gathering a fine layer of dust that I wiped away every Sunday without fail. My younger son's old guitar, which he never quite learned to play properly, stood in the corner of his room like a patient ghost. I told myself I kept these rooms ready not out of stubbornness, but out of faith. Faith that one day the sound of suitcases being dragged up the stairs would return to this house, and everything would go back to the way it was supposed to be. Arvind, in his quiet way, understood the truth long before I allowed myself to see it. I remember one evening, perhaps 12 years after our elder son first left, sitting on the veranda as the call to prayer echoed faintly from a nearby mosque, and the temple bells rang almost in conversation with it. Arvind said something I brushed aside at the time, but have never fully forgotten. He said, "Saroj, I think our sons already know something we don't want to admit to ourselves." I asked him what that meant. He simply shook his head and said, "Nothing. Let's have our tea." I did not press him further that night. I wish now that I had. Because 3 years after that quiet evening, my husband was gone. A sudden heart attack that took him from me in the space of a single terrible morning, before either of my sons could book a flight home in time to say a proper goodbye. And it was only after Arvind's death, when the house became truly, unbearably silent, that I began to understand the shape of what was slowly, carefully being kept from me. That understanding did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, in small hesitations, during phone calls, in questions my sons no longer answered directly. It would take years more before the full truth finally reached me. On an ordinary evening, during an ordinary video call, when I asked one simple question I had asked 100 times before, and for the first time nobody answered right away. Arvind's death changed the arithmetic of my loneliness in a way I was not prepared for. When 2 people share a silence, it can almost feel like companionship, a silence with someone else breathing inside it. When one person is left alone with that same silence, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a presence of its own, one that follows you from room to room, that sits across from you at the dinner table, that lies on the empty side of the bed at night. My sons flew back for the funeral, of course, Both of them, together in the house for the first time in what felt like forever. For those 2 weeks, the old walls remembered how to hold noise again. Relatives came and went. The kitchen was full of the smell of food prepared for mourners. And for a brief, strange moment, grief made our family whole again, in a way that distance never could. I remember thinking, in the middle of all that sorrow, how cruel it was that it took losing my husband to bring my sons back under one roof. But grief has a schedule, even when the heart does not. After the final rites were completed, after the relatives had returned to their own lives, my sons sat me down at the same dining table where we used to eat as a family of 4 and gently began talking about practical matters. My elder son, always the responsible one, spoke about paperwork, the pension, the property documents, the bank accounts that needed to be transferred into my name alone. My younger son mostly listened, occasionally adding a soft word of comfort. His eyes red-rimmed from crying, more than he wanted to admit. At some point, my elder son asked if I wanted to sell the house and move in with one of them in the United States. He said it gently, carefully, the way you might suggest something to a person recovering from surgery. I told him no, without much thought, the words coming out before I could examine them properly. This was my home. This was where Arvind and I had built our entire life. I could not imagine folding 40 years of memory into 2 suitcases and starting over in a country where I did not even know how to operate a washing machine, let alone rebuild an identity at my age. They did not push me. I think in hindsight, they were somewhat relieved, though neither of them would have admitted it at the time. 2 weeks later, they returned to their lives across the ocean, and I returned to mine. Except now, it was a life with 1 fewer person to wait for, and 1 less voice to fill the empty rooms. The years after Arvind's passing settled into a rhythm that I now recognize as its own quiet tragedy, though at the time it simply felt like survival. I woke early, as I always had, made tea for 1 instead of 2, and spent my mornings tending to the small courtyard garden that had somehow survived decades of neglect and love in equal measure. I joined a group of women from the neighborhood who met twice a week to read from religious texts and gossip about their grandchildren, most of whom lived within a short rickshaw ride away. I smiled through those conversations, nodding along as other women complained about their daughters-in-law living too close, meddling too much, visiting too often. I never told them how much I would have given for that particular kind of inconvenience. Video calls became the architecture of my relationship with my sons. Every Sunday, without fail, I would call my elder son first, then my younger son an hour later, timing my calls carefully around their work schedules and their children's routines. I learned the peculiar etiquette of long-distance grandmothering, how to admire a grandchild's school project through a slightly delayed video feed, how to sing a lullaby over a connection that occasionally froze mid-note, how to celebrate birthdays by watching a cake being cut on a screen instead of tasting a single bite of it myself. My elder son had 2 children, a boy and a girl, who called me Dadi, with an accent that made the word sound slightly foreign, even though it was my own language. My younger son married a woman he had met at his workplace, someone kind and warm whenever we spoke, though I always felt a particular ache watching her cook in a kitchen that was not the one I had once hoped my future daughter-in-law would inherit from me. I told myself, for years, that this was simply the modern shape of family. Distance did not mean absence, I reasoned. Love could travel through fiber optic cables just as easily as it once traveled through letters and long train journeys. I built an entire philosophy around this idea, repeating it to myself on the nights when the loneliness felt particularly sharp, when I would find myself standing in my elder son's old room, running my hand along the dusty edge of a cricket trophy, wondering what his laugh sounded like, without the compression of a video call, flattening it into something slightly artificial. What I did not allow myself to examine too closely during all those years was the quiet way the promise kept shifting shape. In the early years after Arvind's death, my son still spoke about eventually returning to India, though the timeline had grown vaguer, less anchored to specific plans and more wrapped in general hopeful language. Once the children finish school, once we're a bit more settled financially, once it makes sense for everyone. I noticed, though I pretended not to, how the conversations about returning became shorter each year, sandwiched between updates about school admissions, work promotions, and house renovations in neighborhoods with names I could not properly pronounce. I noticed how my grandchildren's accents grew thicker, how they began to prefer speaking English even with me, how the small phrases of our mother tongue that I tried to teach them during our calls slowly faded from their vocabulary like ink left too long in the sun. I threw myself into other things to fill the widening gap. I started volunteering at a small charity that helped elderly women in my neighborhood who had no children abroad or otherwise, women whose situations, I told myself, were far worse than mine. At least my sons called every week. At least they sent money without me ever having to ask. At least I reminded myself constantly, they still loved me, even from so far away. I became something of an authority among my friends on the subject of raising successful children who moved abroad. Younger mothers in my neighborhood, watching their own children prepare to study or work overseas, would come to me for advice, and I would offer it generously, wrapped in a confidence I did not always feel. "Let them go," I would tell them. "A bird that stays in the nest too long never learns to fly properly. They will come back when the time is right." I believed my own advice, mostly. I had to. The alternative, the possibility that they might simply never come back, was a thought I kept locked away in a part of my mind I rarely visited. But certain moments forced that locked door open, if only briefly. There was the year my elder son mentioned, almost in passing during a phone call, that he and his wife were considering buying a house, not renting, but buying, taking out what he called a 30-year mortgage, a phrase that landed in my chest like a small, quiet stone. 30 years. I did the arithmetic without meaning to. By the time that mortgage was paid off, I would likely no longer be alive to see it. There was the year my younger son's daughter was born, and instead of returning to India to observe the naming ceremony in our family temple, as tradition dictated, they performed a small version of the ritual in their own living room, guided by instructions I gave them over video call, watching through a screen as a priest they had hired locally chanted prayers I had grown up hearing in person, surrounded by the smell of incense and the warmth of relatives crowded into a single room. There was the year I quietly renewed my passport, telling myself it was simply good practice for an elderly woman to keep her documents in order, though some part of me knew I was preparing for a future trip to see them, a trip that somehow never quite got planned, always postponed by some minor complication on their end or a health concern on mine. Each of these moments was a small crack in the story I had built for myself, the story where distance was temporary and return was inevitable. I patched each crack carefully, the way you patch a wall you know is structurally sound, even as the plaster keeps flaking away. I did not want to look too closely at what those repeated cracks might mean, taken together as a pattern rather than isolated incidents. It took one more year, one more video call, an ordinary Sunday evening, no different in appearance from 100 Sundays before it, for the wall to finally give way entirely. I remember exactly what I was wearing that evening, exactly what tea I had prepared, exactly how the light fell through the courtyard window as I settled into the chair I always used for our calls. I had no idea as I dialed my elder son's number that this particular conversation would be the one where 20 years of careful, comfortable denial would finally collapse into a truth I could no longer avoid. Has your relationship with your child changed since they moved abroad? Maybe the calls are becoming less frequent, the messages are getting shorter, and you sometimes feel like you are no longer part of their everyday life. You love seeing them build a new future, but the distance and their absence can still be difficult to accept. When Your Children Leave for America was created for parents going through this new stage of life, it will help you better understand your emotions, cope with the distance, build a healthier connection with your children, and rediscover your own life along the way. You can find the ebook through the link in the description and pinned comment. I want to describe that evening slowly, because I have replayed it so many times in my mind since then that every small detail has taken on an almost unbearable clarity. It was a Sunday in late autumn, though in Jaipur we do not experience autumn the way it is described in the books my grandchildren read in their American schools. It was simply a slightly cooler evening, the kind where I could sit in the courtyard a little longer than usual before the mosquitoes forced me inside. I had spent the afternoon preparing a particular sweet that my elder son used to love as a child, not because I planned to send it to him, since it would never survive the journey, but because making it gave me something to do with my hands while I waited for the appointed hour of our call. There is a certain kind of loneliness that finds comfort in repetitive tasks, kneading dough, chopping vegetables, folding laundry that does not need folding. I had become something of an expert in that particular kind of comfort over the years. At exactly 6 p.m, my time, which meant it was still morning for my son on the other side of the world, I opened the video call application on the tablet my younger son had bought me 2 years earlier, patiently teaching me over 3 separate phone calls how to use it properly. My elder son's face appeared on the screen, slightly tired, sitting in what I recognized as his home office, a room I had seen countless times but never once stood inside. We talked, as we always did, about small things first. His children's school activities, a minor cold that had passed through their household the previous week, a work project that was taking up more of his time than he would have liked. I told him about the temple renovation happening in our neighborhood, about a friend's granddaughter's upcoming wedding, about the marigolds in the courtyard that had bloomed unusually well this season. These conversations had a rhythm to them, almost a script, one we had refined over hundreds of Sunday calls until the small talk flowed easily, filling the space where deeper conversation might otherwise have been required. I do not know exactly what made me ask the question that evening, of all evenings. Perhaps it was the sweet I had made, sitting untouched on a plate beside me, a small monument to a hope I had never quite been able to abandon. Perhaps it was simply exhaustion, the accumulated weight of 2 decades of careful, polite waiting, finally demanding an answer. Whatever the reason, in the middle of a lull in our conversation, I heard myself ask, in a tone far more casual than the question deserved, "So when do you think you and your brother will finally come back home for good?" I had asked some version of this question many times over the years, and it had always been met with variations of the same hopeful, deflecting answers. "Soon, Ma. We're still figuring things out. Once the children are a bit older." I expected one of these familiar responses this time as well, some soft continuation of the story we had all agreed, silently, to keep telling. Instead, there was a silence. Not the comfortable silence of 2 people who know each other well enough not to need constant conversation, but a heavy, deliberate silence. The kind that exists when someone is choosing their words with great care because they know those words will matter more than usual. I watched my son's face on the screen, saw something shift behind his eyes, a kind of resignation settling over his features, like a curtain being drawn. "Ma," he said finally, "I need to talk to you about something, and I want you to know that this doesn't change how much we love you." I felt my stomach tighten in the particular way it does when you sense, a full second before you understand the words, that something significant and irreversible is about to be said to you. I did not respond. I simply waited, my hands suddenly still in my lap, the sweet on the plate beside me forgotten entirely. He told me, slowly and gently, that he had spoken with his brother the previous week, and that they had decided it was finally time to be honest with me about something they had both known, in their hearts, for a very long time, but had never had the courage to say directly. He said that neither of them intended to move back to India permanently, not in 5 years, not in 10, not ever, in the way I had always imagined, not as a return to living in the house where they grew up, not as a resumption of the life we had once shared under one roof. He explained carefully, as though delivering difficult news in a hospital, that his children had grown up entirely in the American school system, that they thought of English as their first language, that the idea of uprooting them to a country they barely knew at their current ages felt almost cruel to consider. He explained that his career, built over nearly 2 decades in a system very different from the one back home, could not simply be transplanted back to Jaipur without starting over from a position far below where he currently stood. He explained that his wife, who had her own career and her own aging parents to consider in a different city entirely, had her own set of impossible constraints layered onto his. My younger son, when he joined the call a few minutes later, because apparently this had been planned between them beforehand, this careful, coordinated unveiling of a truth they had decided I needed to finally hear, added his own version of the same explanation. He spoke about his daughter's medical needs, a mild developmental condition that required a specific kind of ongoing therapy he did not believe was easily available in Jaipur. He spoke about his wife's family, who had also settled in the United States years earlier, creating a support network that had become essential to their daily functioning as a young family. I listened to both of them, my sons, the two boys I had raised from infancy, from first steps to first days of school to university acceptance letters that had once filled me with such pride, explained to me, gently but unmistakably, that the story I had spent 20 years telling myself was not going to come true. There would be no grand return. There would be no reunion in the house where they had grown up. There would be no version of my old age spent surrounded by grandchildren running through the same courtyard where their fathers had once played. I want to say that I responded with grace, with the kind of wise, understanding calm that a mother in a film might display in a similar scene. I did not. I felt something inside my chest crack open, a sensation so physical that I actually pressed my hand against my sternum, as though I could hold myself together through sheer pressure alone. I heard myself say, in a voice that did not sound entirely like my own, "So all these years, when you said you would come back, you already knew you wouldn't." There was another silence, longer than the first. My elder son eventually admitted that for at least the past 10 years, perhaps longer, he had privately known that a permanent return was extremely unlikely, even as he continued to speak hopefully about it during our calls, partly because he did not want to disappoint me, and partly, he admitted with visible difficulty, because he had not wanted to fully confront that reality himself. I do not remember exactly how the rest of that call ended. I remember crying, though I tried to do so quietly, turning my face slightly away from the camera in a reflexive attempt to protect them from the sight of my grief, even in that moment. I remember my younger son saying, repeatedly, that this did not mean they loved me any less, that they still wanted me to be a central part of their lives, that they hoped I would consider visiting more often, or even reconsidering the idea of moving there myself now that circumstances were different, now that the truth was finally out in the open. After the call ended, I sat alone in that courtyard for a very long time, long after the mosquitoes had begun to bite in earnest, long after the marigolds had disappeared into darkness. I thought about the rooms upstairs, still arranged as though their owners might walk through the door at any moment. I thought about the passport I had renewed for a trip I had never taken. I thought about the 30-year mortgage, the naming ceremony performed over video call, the accents growing thicker with each passing year, all of it suddenly rearranging itself in my memory, not as isolated, explainable incidents, but as a slow, unmistakable pattern that I had simply refused to read correctly until this moment forced my hand. For the first time since Arvind's death, I felt truly, completely alone. Not merely physically alone in a large house, which I had grown accustomed to, but alone in a deeper sense, cut off from a future I had spent decades quietly assuming would eventually arrive. The waiting, I realized that night, had not simply been delayed. It had been, in a sense, I had never allowed myself to consider, entirely imaginary from the very beginning, sustained by a story that everyone involved, including myself, had needed to believe for reasons that had very little to do with what was actually true. I did not sleep much that night, and in the days that followed, as the initial shock began to settle into something more like grief, I found myself facing a question I had never seriously had to ask myself before. If the life I had been waiting for was never going to arrive, who exactly was I supposed to become instead? Grief, I have learned, does not always arrive the way we expect it to. When Arvind died, my grief had a clear shape, a funeral, a body, a date on a calendar that marked the exact moment my life divided into before and after. This new grief, the grief of accepting that my sons were never coming home, had no such shape. There was no funeral for a future that simply failed to arrive. There was no ritual for mourning a version of old age I had quietly designed in my mind, and would now never get to live. In the weeks after that call, I moved through my days in a kind of fog. I still woke early, still made my tea, still tended to the marigolds, but each of these small rituals now felt hollow in a way they had not before, as though I had discovered that a familiar room in my own house had a false wall behind it, and everything I had furnished on this side of the room had been arranged around a door that did not actually lead anywhere. My sons called more frequently in those first few weeks, almost as if trying to compensate through sheer volume of contact for what they had taken away in substance. I answered these calls politely, but I noticed myself pulling back slightly, needing distance to sit with what I had learned before I could return to our usual warmth without the conversation feeling like a performance. It was my friend Kavita, one of the women from my reading group, who finally said something to me that shifted the direction of my thinking. Kavita had never had children of her own, having been widowed young without ever remarrying, and she had built, over 4 decades, an entirely independent life that I had always quietly regarded as somewhat sad, without ever examining that judgment too closely. One afternoon, after I had finally confided in her about the phone call, expecting sympathy for my particular tragedy, she said something that startled me. "Saroj," she said, "I have spent 40 years without children in this house, and I promise you, a full life does not require someone else's return. It requires you deciding to actually live in the one you have." I did not immediately accept this. Some part of me wanted to hold on to my grief a while longer, wanted to insist that my situation was fundamentally different from hers, that I had lost something she had never had to begin with, and therefore never had to mourn. But over the following weeks, as I turned her words over in my mind, I began to recognize the truth buried inside them, a truth I had been avoiding for 20 years. I had built my entire sense of purpose around waiting, and in doing so, I had allowed an enormous portion of my own life to remain unlived, held hostage to a homecoming that I now understood. Looking back honestly, I had never had any real evidence would happen. I began, slowly and without any grand plan, to make small changes. The first was the hardest. I went upstairs into my elder son's old room, and I began packing away the cricket trophies, not to throw them away, but to place them carefully into a trunk, alongside old photographs and childhood report cards, a proper archive of a chapter that had ended rather than a shrine to one that was still ongoing. I did the same with my younger son's guitar, wrapping it carefully in cloth before placing it beside the trophies. It took me the better part of an afternoon, and I cried through most of it, but by evening, both rooms stood empty in a way that felt, for the first time, honest rather than merely lonely. I did not turn those rooms into shrines to the past, but I also did not rush to fill them with new purpose immediately. I let them sit empty for a few weeks, a kind of respectful pause, before I finally decided what to do with the space. Eventually, I converted my elder son's old room into a proper reading and writing space for myself, something I had never had in 40 years of marriage and motherhood. A room that existed for no other reason than my own private use. I converted my younger son's room into a guest room, not for my sons on their eventual occasional visits, but for the wider circle of friends and relatives I had somewhat neglected during my long years of dedicated waiting. I also made a decision that surprised even myself. I enrolled in a certificate course at a local college, something in early childhood education, a subject I had always found interesting, but never had the opportunity to formally study, having married and started a family so young. I was, without question, the oldest student in that classroom, sitting among 19 and 20-year-olds who treated me at first with a kind of polite bewilderment, and later, once they got to know me, with genuine warmth and curiosity about a woman who had decided, at 64, that it was not too late to learn something entirely new. I used that certificate, once I completed it, to volunteer more formally with a local organization that worked with underprivileged children in Jaipur, teaching basic literacy skills a few mornings each week. There was something quietly healing about spending my mornings surrounded by other people's children, children who needed exactly the kind of patient, steady attention I had spent decades perfecting on my own sons, attention that had nowhere else productive to go now that my sons were grown and settled thousands of miles away. I did not stop loving my sons, nor did I stop wanting them in my life. What changed was the terms on which I allowed that love to exist. I stopped measuring the value of our relationship by the promise of a future reunion that might never come, and I started measuring it by the quality of what we actually had in the present. Our video calls became less about updates on an imaginary future timeline and more about genuinely enjoying each other's company in whatever fragmented, imperfect way distance allowed. I asked my grandchildren more questions about their actual lives in America, instead of quietly resenting the accents and habits that marked how different their world was from the one I had imagined for them. 8 months after that difficult phone call, I finally took the trip I had been quietly preparing for over the years without ever actually booking it. I flew to visit my elder son's family for 6 weeks, my first time setting foot in the United States. I will not pretend it was an easy transition. The house was comfortable, even beautiful, but it felt entirely unlike any home I had ever known, situated in a quiet suburban neighborhood where I rarely saw another human being walking on the street, where the silence outside felt somehow more foreign to me than the silence inside my own house back in Jaipur. But I also experienced things during that trip that softened something in me that had been hard for a very long time. I watched my granddaughter's school play from the audience instead of through a delayed video feed, and something about hearing her voice in the same physical space as mine, rather than compressed through a speaker, moved me in ways I had not expected. I cooked in my son's kitchen for 2 straight weeks, filling their freezer with meals that would last them long after I returned home, and I watched him eat food that tasted, he told me with tears in his eyes, exactly like his childhood. A taste he had apparently been quietly missing more than he had ever admitted to me over the phone. I also had a long conversation with my elder son during that visit, sitting together on his back porch one evening after the children had gone to bed, in which he finally told me things he had perhaps never fully articulated, even to himself. He told me about the quiet guilt he had carried for years, the way he had structured entire phone calls around avoiding certain topics simply to protect me from a truth he did not know how to deliver kindly. He told me that watching me finally build an independent life back home, one that did not revolve entirely around waiting for him, had actually made him feel less guilty, not more, because he no longer felt responsible for my entire happiness resting on a decision he was not able to make. I returned to Jaipur after those 6 weeks with a strange, unexpected sense of peace, one that had nothing to do with resignation and everything to do with clarity. I understood, in a way I had not before, that my son's decision to build their lives in America was not a rejection of me or of the family we had once been. It was simply the shape their lives had taken, just as my own life, now filled with students and volunteer work and a small writing desk in a room that used to hold cricket trophies, had taken its own new and unexpected shape. I still miss them, every single day. I still sometimes walk past those 2 upstairs rooms and feel a small ache for the noise they used to hold. But I no longer feel as though I am simply waiting for my real life to resume once they finally come home. I understand now, at 64 years old, that this is my real life, not a waiting room before some imagined reunion, but an entire, complete existence of its own, one I had to learn, slowly and painfully, how to actually inhabit. If there is one thing I would want another mother in my position to understand, it is this: your children moving on with their lives does not mean your own story has ended. It simply means it is finally your turn to decide, after everyone else's chapters have unfolded, what the rest of yours is going to look like.